This podcast is brought to you by Podcast Nation.
You are listening to As a Woman, episode 127, Fertility Fraud with Eve Wiley.
Welcome to As a Woman, the podcast hosted by fertility physician Dr. Natalie Crawford to educate and empower women. Each week, learn about your health, your fertility, and how they relate to your true self. Become a part of the community fostering collaboration over competition while learning how to authentically find your voice and amplify others as a woman.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to the As a Woman podcast. I am really excited and honored to have Eve on today to tell her story. Eve and I know each other through a few different connections, but she is a force and she is really trying to make change in my industry, which is overall new, and that means kind of unregulated. She is from a small town in East Texas, and she uncovered a life-changing family secret about her genetic identity. She is referred to as the fertility industry's Erin Brockovich. She has had her story documented on ABC's 2020. She's been a huge advocacy for donor-conceived rights and women's reproductive rights. You are going to really be interested in what she has to say. Here we go. Eve, I am so honored and excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me and the As a Woman podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on.
We were kind of backtracking or gossiping before we started, and it turns out like our husbands know each other, you know, my cousins. We have a lot of personal connection in that way, but you really became near and dear to me because of your advocacy in the fertility world in a very unique space, really talking about fertility fraud and what it means and helping, you know, tangibly pass legislation. But before we get to all of that, I'd love it if I would just open the floor and let you share your story as you feel comfortable about how this even came to be something that you became so passionate about.
Right. Well, so I'm from a really small town in East Texas called Center. It's about 5,000 people, 30 miles from Nacogdoches, which is, you know, like the big town in deep East Texas for us. My parents struggled with infertility for years, and at the direction of their fertility doctor, they looked at artificial reproductive technologies, and specifically they looked at artificial insemination by an anonymous sperm donor. The doctor gave them this list from California Cryobank of sperm donors, and it was this list with a donor number, physical characteristics, interest, and level of education. So not a lot of information. And then he also told them that he had 3 local donors. And my mom had said, you know, I really don't want a local donor because the doctor was saying, never tell her or, you know, your child how they were born. This is not important.
Interrupting your story 1 minute in. That's what the doctor said?
Yes, because I mean, think about this at the time, right?
Yeah.
In the 80s, there was so much secrecy around infertility. And the thought was that someone who is donor conceived, they don't need to know about their genetic identity. It doesn't matter. And because a lot of this was male infertility factor, they wanted to protect the secrecy and you know, males are a little bit fragile. Protect their ego by just a little bit by not telling people about that. And so there was so much stigma around infertility. So, you know, that was the thinking at the time. You know, now we know way better that genetic identity is incredibly important.
Yes.
But that was the way that the narrative went. So yes, so he told them, you know, don't tell the donor conception story, you know, your mom, your dad, and that's it. But because of being in such a small town, my mom was very adamant, I don't want a local donor, because how is she supposed to know who my half sibling is? And
right. It's kind of weird. What if you dated
a
them
little
in
bizarre.
school?
Or if she's like going in the grocery store and she knows it's a local donor and she's like, okay, is it that guy? You know, she, you know,
Small
is it weird
town.
to see total small town? I mean, just total small town. So they selected donor 106 from California Cryobank, and they used that donor multiple times. And they finally conceived me and I was born. So at that time, probably like 2 or 3 months later, they were pregnant again, but this time they were pregnant naturally. And so they were pregnant with my dad's biological child. When I was 7 years old, that dad, Doug, passed away from cardiomyopathy. And so this is my little sister, Joanna's biological father. And my mom is a nurse. And at that point, she was like, wow, I wonder what Eve like, what does she need to know about her medical information? So then she started calling California Cryobank and trying to get more information. At the time, they had said that they could update the donor records for medical information when I was 18 years old. And so in between there, she was collecting as much data as possible, her medical records from Dr. McMorris, all of that, and preparing for that. Well, when I was 16, I was going through her emails. She's a school nurse. And I had a habit of combing through those and getting all the juicy gossip on my friends.
I love it.
Or deleting an email if it was from a teacher that was like, Eve did not do so well on a test. But when I was doing that, I found all this communication from California Cryobank. And these titles were like artificial insemination and donors and not weird things to see, because I grew up in a small town. My grandfather was a cattle rancher. So I just kind of assumed that my mom was like, I don't know, buying bull sperm for him or something.
Like
I don't know.
Cow insemination stuff.
Something. So, but then I clicked on it and one of them had my birthday. And
that's how you found out?
That is how I found out. It was like 10 p.m. one night. And then I did a quick, this was like Yahoo search, not even Google yet, searched. And I was like, okay, this is exactly what artificial insemination means. Okay. The weird thing is I always knew there was a secret. I didn't know that I was the secret. You look at my little sister who's 14 months younger. She has this beautiful olive complexion skin. She has dark hair, dark eyes. And I was blue-green eyes, blonde hair, very, very fair skin. Even our interests were that we could not be more different if we tried. And we were so close. And I know that's not extremely uncommon, but I think that it was just, I did question, was I adopted? Was I a product of an affair? So, just the crazy things you're like, I could be.
You're like, what did mom do? Something's up here,
yeah,
right?
It's like, I have to be adopted because it didn't fit. But like I said, I knew there was a secret. I just didn't know that I was a secret. And come to find out later that there's actually a name for that, and it's called the thought unknown. You always knew something was there, you just didn't know what that thought was. So putting words to that. So anyway, so then I confronted her, and she just started bawling, and she was like, I was going to tell you, but by the time that you would understand, your dad had passed away. Like, you could barely grasp the concept of death. So how was I supposed to say, well, let's see, that's not your real dad because of infertility? And so it's just, I totally understand. It doesn't make it right, but I have so much empathy and compassion for, it was so hard. I can't imagine.
And nobody talked about it then.
Nobody talked about it. So, but she did all the right things, right? She had this huge folder for me, and we were able to go through all of the conversations she was having on Yahoo Messenger board. She printed all of that stuff out. So I could really see that she was building this case for when I turned 18 to tell me. So I at least had, that proof. And then it just, we just kind of embarked on this. I wanted to know who he was. I could look in the mirror and trying to map out these things that are familiar. And I didn't really see much of that back that was reflected in my family. I had these burdens that I was bearing that weren't mine, like my father's heart condition. Now, did I have to be worried about that? I didn't know. I didn't have half of my medical information. So anyway, so then when I was 18, I contacted California Cryobank, and I sent them my mom's medical records, and then we just waited. And about a year later, I got a phone call, and they said a full year. And I'm like emailing and checking in. I'm like, hey, because they're just supposed to send him a letter, the donor, and he's supposed to update his medical information and mail it back. And that's all that they could do. So, because when he donated under anonymity. And it's not like it is now where you can't really promise anonymity, because anonymity is dead with commercial DNA testing. He didn't have an option of being an open donor. So it took a full year. And I had this letter that I typed up, and I wanted the cryobank to give it to him. And it was a difficult and awkward letter to write, but basically the gist of it was, I want my medical information. That was, my number one priority, but also I wanted to know who he was. This is half of me. And, I think that was a really important part that I'm acknowledging now as an adult and not as an 18-year-old, naive 18-year-old. Never in my mind did I think you would reject me. I think I really thought that I was gonna have this fairy tale story. And so, yeah, so he got that letter. He sent one back. We started emailing. We started talking on the phone. He came to Austin when I was in college to meet me.
Oh,
And we just had this still have this beautiful fairy tale story. I started calling him dad. We say, I love you. He officiated my wedding.
Oh my, so you had this like thing you felt like was missing that you didn't know what it was. Suddenly you
Yes.
felt like that puzzle piece kind of came into your life.
Like this, I was going to finally know what it was like to have a biological father, to have a dad. And my kids call him Papa. He spends holidays with us. I mean, how
He still
weird
does?
is it? Still does. Is, hey dad, meet mom. Like I got to introduce my mom and my dad.
I love it.
You know,
I love
it's
it.
so bizarre,
Yeah.
so weird. Like y'all have a kid together and you've never met. Like how weird is that? So yeah, it was, it was everything that I wanted. It didn't mean that it was easy all the time. We were trying to navigate this, but I mean, he's great. I don't know if you've seen him on camera at all, but he's just, teddy bear. He's just wonderful. So after I got married, shortly after, we ended up getting pregnant and we had our son Hutton. And, right off the bat, we were having, crazy medical stuff. He had pyloric stenosis and
Weird
then he had
stuff.
reoccurring pyloric stenosis and he couldn't tolerate certain foods. And anyway, just kept going on and on and on. So he was having all these exploratory surgeries and we had this big team of doctors here in Dallas and they couldn't figure it out. So we went to this doctor in Austin and he works from this like genetic expression, like a genealogist, not a genealogist, but like a geneticist. And he said the cheapest and easiest way for me to get this data on genetic variants is 23andMe plus Health. And so we all did it. And I always knew just from talking to California Cryobank that I would have half siblings. They said that he was a very popular donor. I just don't really know what that means. So I knew that I was going to have a lot of half siblings. Now, knowing that there are no birth limits on donors, there's no cap or anything. I mean, that could mean hundreds of half siblings for me. I always knew, but they told me I was one of the oldest ones. So at the time I was thinking like I still had some years before those turned 18. So we do this DNA test and the doctor calls and says, hey, Hutton has celiac disease. We want to get, the pylori sample and get, and make sure that that's what it is, but this is what this test has said. And I didn't know what celiac disease was. And they started explaining to me autoimmune disorders and how those are hereditary. So I called dad and I'm like, hey, this is what Hutton has. Does anybody in your family know? I call my mom. So we go through the whole thing. And then in Blake's family too. And nobody. So it was, kind of like a red flag, but I was like, okay, well, whatever. And, I was so blinded by Hutton's sickness that I didn't even think about looking at the genealogy part of it at that point. Well, then I started getting these emails saying, you have a close match. You have a close match. And we finally get Hutton, well, about 6 months later. And then I start looking at these close matches. And one of them, there were like 2 boys, or 3 boys, I guess I should say. And so I'm talking to one of them and it says, I don't know, are you familiar with the platform? So close family, when you're a half sibling, you're a close family to first cousin. So I kind of thought they were first cousins because I thought it would be telling me that, hey, this is a half sibling, but that's not how it works. So this didn't make any sense. My mom has 2 brothers. They don't have biological children. So I was like, ooh, did I just, stumble upon a family secret here?
Oh yeah. You're
maybe
like,
maybe they have children and they don't know. And then dad, same thing. He has a brother who doesn't have children. He has a sister who doesn't have children. So it still wasn't making sense. Well, then I start talking to them and one is 13 years older than I am. And it was actually my mom who said, Eve, those are your half siblings. And so I talked to the first one and he knows that he's donor conceived and he is, sweet little redneck. I just thought that he just didn't really understand what I was telling him because it just wasn't clicking. And so we went through the whole thing and then the second one is 13 years older than I am. And that didn't really make sense, right? So that was like another little red flag for me. And then the third one, I thought I was here dropping this huge bomb on him because he was like, I am not donor conceived. He is like, I look like my dad. I have a brother that I look alike and I'm on the other side, like, oh, this is what we all say. I know this is what we all think. And I'm like, oh my gosh, why do I get to be the bearer of bad news? So I was like, okay, all right, I'll humor you. Okay. So if we're first, cause he kept going back to, we're first cousins. And so I was like, okay, if we are first cousins, tell me about your uncles. And he said, well, I only have one uncle and his name is Kim McMorris. And my world stopped. Kim McMorris, Dr. Kim McMorris, my mom's fertility doctor, the man that when my mom told the story of, how they couldn't get pregnant and, they prayed for me so much. And then I was born. And then later he became the person with so much. This man who is a pillar in our community at home. And, everybody talks so wonderful about him. He inseminated my mother without her knowledge or consent with his own sperm. And he is my biological father.
It's outrageous and atrocious. And it's happening so much more that we're becoming aware of. And I just can't even grasp what it must have been like for you to realize this. So you're talking to him and he tells you about the uncle, the name. Immediately, you know who this name was, because this was an important person in your mom's life and, in your town. And what did you do? What did you do after that? I mean, did you call your mom? I mean, what did you do? I don't even know what you do with that information.
She was actually with me. We were on vacation and they were upstairs. They were watching. I remember it. Tanya. And I was downstairs and I was sitting there and I remember what I did is it was silence because I had said to him, that is my mom's fertility doctor. And in that moment we both knew. And then it was like, oh, whoa, hold on. And we got off the phone and I actually remember looking down and where I was sitting at the bar had this like live edge stone. And I guess I had been rubbing it. And so my thumb was bleeding. And so I got up and bandaged it up really quickly. And then I drained my glass of wine and I was like, oh my God, I got to go tell my mother. And so I ran upstairs and I told her and she didn't believe me.
Because she trusted this man. Of course she didn't believe you, right?
And that's what she said. She's like, Eve, you are wrong. Steve is your dad. We have the medical records that say it. We have checked with California Cryobank. They are the one that connected us to him. I don't know what you've seen, but like, this is wrong. I kept telling her over and over again. And I have never seen anybody go into shock before. And she went into shock to the point where she was shaking. My husband, he was like, do we need to go to the hospital? Like, put blankets on her. She just couldn't wrap her head around something like this. And that's when I told her, I was like, Mom, people lie. DNA does not lie. Yeah. And I am looking at this and this, my DNA is half of Kim McMorris. But it was so hard and so hard for her. And this is why I think that we see the offspring, the children, the products of this in, that have come forward more so than the actual victims that are mothers and fathers. And I think it's because, and I've been over this so many times with my mother, you were allowed to have opposite feelings about this. You can be so happy that I'm your daughter and so grateful that it's me. And you can love me so much and wish nothing else. But you can also be incredibly traumatized and upset around the deception, around the conception. Those two things do not have to exist together. And I think that is so hard because they feel like if they say,
I don't want this, you don't exist. Right.
And I don't want you to exist. And it is so hard to separate that and not conflate the two. And so it's really interesting to see how that's kind of played out as well.
Oh my goodness. I can only imagine feeling this feeling too for you, where you kind of felt like, okay, my parents, they bought sperm, they chose a donor. This was their decision. Look how great he is. I know him. And then suddenly realizing that you're kind of born out of a lie that your family had no control over. And that immediately put that half of your genetics, I presume, into a perspective that you suddenly did not like. Is that a true statement? I mean, how do you even comprehend that?
Well, and that's what it is. I mean, it is, for me, I was 30 years old, starting over for the third time in my life. And why has my genetic identity been a lie? And why is it something that I've constantly had to fight for? And when it affects me is one thing, but this directly affected my child. He had 12 surgeries that he did not have to have if I would have known my correct medical information. And so, those unintended consequences just keep going and going. And then when I think about it, if we really stop and think about how this could happen, this is in the 80s. This is in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, where the American Society of Reproductive Medicine has said all sperm must be quarantined for 6 months and checked for AIDS. So now you have a doctor who is in the OR exposed to blood all of the time, is inseminating his patients with fresh samples.
Oh, so gross. I mean,
and then think about that even more. It's so wrong. But you have a woman that's driving 30 or 40 minutes. And I mean, you know how it is. Your cycle doesn't wait. It's like, oh, sorry, cycle can't hit on the weekends.
Yeah.
Can't be fertile this weekend. It's anytime. So you have a woman that drives in 30 minutes. You don't have cell phones. You have beepers and bag phones, maybe. I don't know. So sperm can live outside of cervical mucus for what? 30 minutes, an hour? Not even?
No, not even.
Not
An
even?
hour.
Maybe. But you're not going to take the chance that your patient's going to get a flat tire and waste that, right? So you have your patient come in, you prep the cervix, and then the doctor goes in, he
Goes the other
masturbates in the
room.
next room, brings the sample in and deposits it inside. I mean, you are penetrating digitally the vagina,
It's
puts his
so
semen
invasive in this
inside.
context. It is such
It is so
sexual
invasive.
abuse and trauma.
And that is why Senator Huffman and Stephanie Click decided to put the Fertility Fraud bill for Texas under the sexual assault penal codes, because when they heard this and they heard me explain it to them this way, they said that this is a sexual assault. They understand. They filed the statute of limitations and stuff to not reflect and mirror the same thing as, forcible rape, but it is in our penal codes as a sexual assault now for Texas.
And that's because of you. And you're trying to do this in a lot of different ways, because there's some things here that I think when anybody hears your story, it's very easy to say, oh yeah, well, that's wrong, right? Okay, that's obviously wrong. However, by the laws of the time, that was not illegal, correct?
Correct. So the landscape of that is when you have anonymity, it's going to breed fraud, right? You don't have checks and balances. And in 1996, Congress passed an amendment saying that no federal funds were to be allowed for embryo research. So all of that fell into the fertility industry type stuff. So now you have a fertility industry that is now operating as a medical services and not under the scrutiny of research. And so that's where we really saw this divide. And that is how the industry has been allowed to go unchecked for so long. So basically the lab is where it is regulated, but then when it is going to, clinics or administration,
The doctor's
like
office, right?
the doctor's
He
office,
didn't have an
there's
embryology lab or something like that.
no, he didn't have any of that. He had his own tank. That's it. His nitrate tank to keep his own sperm. So there was no oversight for him, except his nurses, and his nurses didn't even know this.
They
I mean,
had
I've
no
spoken
idea.
to his nurses, and they're horrified. The ones that were there, they are horrified. They told me that he was seeing between 50 and 70 patients a day.
I mean, how many inseminations do you think he did?
No clue, but that donor catalog list, that is just the sperm that he had in his cryo tank. And there are over 40 donors.
This is
Plus his 3.
Oh.
So, and that's, I mean, that was the thing is, there wasn't like Google reviews. This is just word of mouth and all of that. But I mean, they were like all of the time we were prepping sperm for inseminations. And then I ended up confronting him because I wanted to know the scope of the problem. And I didn't tell him at first that I have my medical records. And he told me that he only did this 1 to 2 times, but I was looking at 23andMe. Yeah. And I already saw 3. So I already knew at that point he was lying.
You're already lying.
And already lying. And this was hard for me because all I've ever wanted is to know my biological father.
You just want the truth. You just want the truth. And you wanted you wanted that relationship, and not that it'd be a weird way, but by lying about it, he completely, that's not happening, right?
Oh, he was trying. Yeah. Well, I mean, immediately it's like,
Obviously,
oh, signed off on like parental rights and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, doesn't matter. I am your daughter. I am it doesn't matter what kind of contract like you put up with this. I am your daughter. But I think that was so hard for me because I still had a choice. How was I going to have this genuine and authentic relationship with him if I knew that he was going to lie about it? There was nothing genuine and authentic about this. I was always going to be the gatekeeper to his secret. And was I ever going to know if he was just talking to me to appease me and, not to tell his secret?
Keep you quiet. Yeah.
Exactly. And then, I think the big push for me came from, what about my other half siblings? What if I have other half siblings that I have the key to their medical mystery or to their children that are suffering? And then after I came forward, which was really hard for me to do.
It's so vulnerable, so personal.
I think the most shocking thing is how many people ended up supporting the doctor. And
no, really?
Oh my gosh. I don't know. Have you ever seen that movie Bernie with
Yes.
Matthew McConaughey?
Hmm.
That is that area of town. And that's what happened. These people supported him. And this is their beloved doctor, a pillar in their community and their church. And, they told me things which I believe, these are very marginalizing comments, but it's kind of what we do in our society, right? It's like toxic
Hmm.
positivity. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for him. To which I would say, I'm not talking about me being grateful to be alive. I'm talking about the deception around the conception and an unethical doctor. Well, at least you have doctor's genes, or, you were so wanted. He was just doing the Lord's work. I mean, I could go
Oh,
on and
stop
on.
it. It's
Yes.
so gross.
People wrote into the Nacogdoches Centennial paper talking about how ungrateful I was and
Oh
how
my
we have
God,
to,
Eve.
rally around this doctor. And it's sad,
It is.
but that is rape culture. That is victim blaming. That is
Hmm.
victim shaming. And it's rape culture. Here I am with all of these facts in his handwriting. This is what it says. And people still chose to believe him. Isn't that wild?
It is wild, but it is such a, let's say, a testament to society right now, and how, sometimes these things, you can have all the facts right in front of you and somebody just will not believe it because they
Mhm.
don't like accepting what it means, which really is that they were wrong about this person, right?
Right.
One of the biggest things that people get unsolicited advice about is their skin. So if you're tired of hearing that you should just wash your face at night or do this or do that, it's time to get some actual help. And there's a lot of buzz about what's right for you, but in my opinion, it's best to get advice from real experts. And that's why we're excited to partner with Apostrophe. Apostrophe is an online platform that connects you with an expert dermatology team. It allows you to get customized acne treatment for your unique skin. Through Apostrophe, you can get access to both oral and topical medications, things that are used clinically with proven ingredients to help clear acne. Simply fill out an easy online consultation about your skin goals. You'll have a virtual consultation, and then you'll get your own personalized treatment plan. Personally, I love how simple it was to sign up for your visit, the personalized treatment plan, and access to an expert team. We do have a special deal for the audience. You can get your first visit for only $5 at apostrophe.com/AAW when you use our code AAW. That's a saving of $15. The code is only available to our listeners. So to get started, go to apostrophe.com/AAW, click Get Started. Use the code AAW to sign up, and you'll get your first visit for only $5. Thank you, Apostrophe, for sponsoring this episode.
It's that tribal mentality. How
Mm.
dare she go against the tribal leader type thing.
So I was surprised to learn that he's still practicing, right?
So this is interesting. So he has retired from gynecological services, so he's not doing pap smears anymore. So I have a lot of siblings, but several of them are still in the community, and some of them are in the medical community. So they see him quite a bit at the hospital. One of them actually sees him a lot. He was the gynecologist for two of our sisters.
Stop it. Stop it.
Uh-huh.
For his
He
his own daughters.
for his own daughter, and he's delivered 3 of his grandchildren. They had no idea.
He knew and they didn't know.
I mean, how could he not have known?
I mean, he must have known. I bet he kept some secret record too with
I
how many.
swear he has a black book
I
somewhere.
bet he does, right? I
I
mean, like,
swear he
there's some
does.
narcissism here when you're putting your own sperm into somebody else that, I mean, right? Like, it's not like we can even argue that this is before sperm banks existed and there
Right.
was no option for sperm banks. So there were good sperm banks, California Cryobanks, a great one. There were options for safe and good quality sperm. So we can't even,
Right.
even it would still be bad, but we can't even go down the road of, well, there was no other way to get sperm. It had to be something like this, as wrong as it would be. That's not even the
Right.
case. Your
No.
parents thought they bought sperm from a really good sperm bank, and he
Yeah.
just threw it in the trash, put it in his thing. I mean, who knows what he did with it? Never even
Yeah.
ordered it. Who knows?
There's definitely a level of, some kind of God complex here. I mean, especially, if you think of it as like, here are these his patients, God cannot give you a baby. I can give you a baby. I am God when God fails. And I think that, for him, I think it really fed into probably some of that narcissism.
Yeah.
He says that he was just trying to, give his patients a baby, give them what they wanted. But if there was nothing wrong with it, then why not just be honest? because they would have said, oh, no,
No.
we don't want that.
Right.
No, but this goes back to consent and transparency.
So you've worked hard in the state of Texas to make this now illegal under a sexual assault essential category, which is absolutely what it should be. You're now working on other states. Is that your current status of what you're trying to do? Kind of update us on what's going on for you.
Yes. So I passed the bill in 2019 in
Congrats.
Texas. Thank you. And then 2020, I was 8 months pregnant and flew to Florida to testify on behalf of a victim who was unable to testify. And that was right before the world shut down, but that one passed. Colorado passed, Arkansas, Utah, Arizona. So those have passed. And then Indiana had a bill passed in 2019, a week before mine did. And then California has had one since the late 90s. So that's the current landscape. Right now we have New York, Ohio, Kentucky. I actually just listened to Kentucky's today in committee. It passed out of committee. And then Ohio is being heard tomorrow to be voted on. So yeah, so that's kind of what I'm doing now, is just state by state. My goal is to get to 10, and then we can take it to a federal level. And that way there is good model legislation.
Should be. Do you find resistance at the legislative level because these are difficult things to talk about? So much stigma around infertility. A lot of people don't love, assisted reproductive technology in general. It doesn't really fit with certain religious beliefs. And so I'm curious if you're finding
Catholic Church.
I mean, I'm just saying, are you finding it hard to get in front of certain people or to get them to listen to you because of some of those, barriers we find in the fertility space?
So yes and no. I think that fertility fraud, doctors doing this has so much bipartisan support. We can all agree that this is so unethical and should not happen. And because of the language that is very narrowly tailored, it doesn't get a lot of opposition, which is great. Now, there was opposition in Florida, but it was only from the Catholic Church with the way that they had it written when it came to pre-embryonic cells. As soon as that language was changed, then they were fine. The ASRM has openly said that they will not comment on these bills because they do not believe that this is happening anymore. They don't want to breathe life into this.
And I really think this is a no-brainer from ASRM, that this is a hard no, right? Like no. So,
and they have said that. They have said that this was never a standard level of practice and this was never acceptable. So they have said that. They've just largely agreed to not comment on the legislation, but they have said that they will keep an eye on the legislation to make sure that there are other things that they can't get on board with. For example, in Florida, the bill was actually more broad, and it put basically like some regulations with clinics saying each clinic had to submit a sheet of paper that had standard protocols on how the reproductive material was being administered. And they did come out and they lobbied hard against that. And it worked because they gutted the bill just to include fertility fraud.
Interesting.
And that was in response to the mix-ups that were hitting the news quite frequently. And there were a few in Florida. Because the problem with what we have now is we don't know the scope of the problem. We don't, because
there's
clinics
so many
aren't
people
required.
who have no idea.
No idea. But also when it comes to, so there was a study I'm sure you're aware of, 1 in 5 clinics were reported to have mislabeled, mishandled, or misdiagnosed. But then you ask the ASRM and they're like, well, we report like 2%. Nobody's required to report those numbers. So we don't even really know what the numbers are. And so for a victim of any type of fertility fraud or fertility negligence, you have very limited choices. You have an ability to do a lawsuit, but do you really want to go through years and years of a lawsuit and being deposed? And like, if you're still trying to have a baby, it's so stressful and, all of this, or you can settle in mediation with a non-disclosure, which is most people is what they do.
But then nobody else ever finds out.
Bingo. And that's exactly what happens. And so we don't get an accurate snapshot of that. And they have said that if we have more regulations, it's going to make it more expensive. I have offered them the question of how and show me where, because I refuse to believe that parents are going to say, no, I won't pay $10 extra or $20 extra, whatever it is, to make sure that reproductive material that is mine is going to me and not going to someone else.
That doesn't make sense to me. Okay, so we have a clinic, there's 2 of us, it's our clinic, right? Any sperm that comes in, there's like 2 papers, everybody fills out, double I's on everything. What's the name? What's the name? Show it to the patient, show the original vial to the patient, show the one. I mean, like we show so many things and sign and papers. And I mean, what is it? The cost of an extra sheet of paper and a binder? I just
Yeah.
can't get on
Extra set
board
of eyes.
with that is going to take more money or increase the cost of the procedure. And also, I also can't get on board that that's not worth doing. That's the most
I know.
important thing that we do is
Mm-hmm.
guaranteeing that we have the correct gametes, the correct samples for anybody
Mm-hmm.
who's coming in. And that is where everybody should slow down, get the extra eyes, do the extra step, because that's truly, of all the cool, amazing things I do, that stuff's the most important. I mean, and I'm OCD about your name, your birthday, your name, your birthday, who filled out this, what did
Good.
the embryo say, what did that, what color was it? I mean, like, but that's how it should be, right? You should have a bunch of checks and balances.
Right.
It should be on a lot of different people to check it. And
Mhm.
if there's any discrepancy, that doesn't go in anybody, right? Like,
Right.
and that's
Well,
it.
and you just listed all of the ways that you ensure that there's no human error. But that's just, I mean, that speaks to you as a practitioner and how important it is for you to take the time and the level of care that you give your patients. And I can't say that that's how every doctor is because they decide how they want to do it.
But they should
It's
be. I
wild.
mean, come on.
I know. And they're not going to do it unless they're mandated
I
to
mean,
do
to
it.
me, this is a no. Okay, we're gonna so I now know what you need from me on my end of things to help you in your mission. What about from my audience? So we've got a great audience here, and I know that your story and your advocacy and this passion you have to make this more known, transparent, improve processes. You're not just trying to get justice for people who've been victims of this. You're really trying to, at the heart of it, you don't want it to happen to other people. And you're trying to
Right.
help change over the system. And it has to start by 1, making it illegal to do so. And then 2, checks and balances to make sure it doesn't happen. But how can we as a community rally with you? What do you need from us?
That's a great question. What I really, really need is, I'm only one person. And I can tell you that, first of all, go follow me on Instagram or Twitter. You can go to my website, evewiley.com, and I keep everything up to date as far as legislation. And I can tell you that every call to action that I post where people, you don't even have to be in the state. All you do is send a quick email. You could click the link, that I post. And it is so important for these legislators to hear from people because what I have found is with these legislators, they don't know a lot unless they have personally been through some sort of infertility and gone through some sort of ART. They don't have the language to talk about it.
Yeah.
They don't have the knowledge. There's so much education. And then on the flip side of that, they're seeing 5,000 bills a session. So it's really important whenever you have 5, 10, 15, 20 emails come through.
It
Because
highlights
then
it as this is maybe a little important,
exactly.
Right?
Well, in their office, they're like, hey,
Yeah.
we got to look at, and it makes a difference because when you're a bill, you got to get placed on a calendar to get voted on. You could have a perfect bill, no opposition, and it'll die just because nobody placed it on the calendar. So even though you think you're one person, it makes a big difference when it comes to legislation. And for these legislators, these fertility fraud bills, when I started this in 2019, I was doing this as like, this is the purpose of my pain. It's not a crime. This is a moral statement. I'm doing this. And then I started to collect stories over the years and just see, we've identified over 60 doctors who have done this. But more than that, it's bigger. It's all types of like fertility negligence, and there's so much more. But I can't make those changes, and you can't get a legislator to make big changes right now. So really, these fertility fraud bills are like Trojan horses of education to these legislators. Our laws are 30 years behind technology. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That gap is growing. And this is so important because we have something right now with fertility fraud that we can all agree on.
Yeah. Bipartisan issue that this is. And it's like universally assault against women. Yes. By male providers, right? There are some fabulous male providers out there, so I'm not going against them, but this is a very distinct thing that is happening. And I feel like especially women, but everybody, but all women should be really up in arms about this. And if you've ever been in a gynecologist office, you know how vulnerable it just is to have your feet up in stirrups. You can't see anything. You can't control anything. It's such a powerless position. And then to be abused in that position. It's terrible.
Absolutely. And I think that, with this, it's a way that what we do with this is going to decide all the things in the future that we don't know. How are we going to handle things that technology is going to create with ART, artificial wounds, genetic editing would be another one.
CRISPR, all that stuff. Yep.
All that stuff, things that like we haven't even thought of yet. And if we can't decide what to do with this, how are we going to handle it in 20, 30 years?
Yeah, this one's a no-brainer, right?
This is a no-brainer. So this is that Trojan horse to really be like, hey guys, y'all got a lot of catching up education to do, but here is what's on the horizon. Y'all need to have task force that is looking into this. And then the other big thing is the voice here that is always missing is that of the donor conceived person. How can we do this in a way that is best for them? How can we make sure that they have their medical information? Like there has to be a better way. We can't just send them off into the world and they find out they have 200 half siblings, biodiversity concerns. I mean, there are so many things that need to be addressed. And
you got to start with the big easy one, right?
You got to start with the big easy one because you got to educate these legislators. And as far as the listeners, you guys have the ability to do that. You guys have the ability to send them emails to say, hey, this is important, because our infertility rates are only going up. We are only using these more and more often, and it needs to be in a responsible way.
I could not agree more. Eve, thank you so much for coming on and being so open and honest and really just enlightening, I think, everybody to this side of the field that they don't really want to acknowledge exists, but it definitely does. And I agree with you. We should all be able to stand cohesively with you that this issue is wrong and help you get this legislation passed. So remind everybody again where your Instagram is and how we can go follow along so we can send emails and drive everybody crazy with our obvious support for your cause.
Make noise. You can find me on Instagram at Eve A. Wiley, and Wiley's Wiley. My Twitter handle is Eve Andrews Wiley, and then you can go visit my website at www.evewiley.com. Thank you so much for having me and giving me a platform for my voice and sharing my story.
Honored to have you. Honored to have you. Thank you. Huge thanks to Eve for joining us. And I really hope you all heard and listened and feel inspired to work with us to advocate for change and for reproductive responsibility and to help advocate for reproductive rights. Love you all so much. Appreciate your support on the podcast. I have some great episodes coming up for you soon. As always, you can follow along on Instagram at nataliecrawfordmd or check out the YouTube channel, Natalie Crawford MD. Thanks, friends.
My name is Len Webb.
And I'm Vincent Williams.
We'd like to welcome you to our documentary podcast, The Class of 1989. Over the course of 6 episodes, Vincent and I will examine the importance of 6 Black films that came out in '89 and how they shaped and influenced popular culture, filmmaking, and society in general.
Come on, sucker. Let's get it on.
New episodes will begin running weekly on March 6th.